Do the front wheel hubs on your MGB look old and greasy like this? Do you even know the state of the bearings, the races, or the grease seals? Stick around and find out how you can learn how to disassemble them, degrease all of the parts, eliminate any rust on them, evaluate the condition of the bearings and the races, remove and replace the bearing races themselves, pack a new set of bearings, install a new grease seal, and reassemble them so that they look clean and beautiful and are functional like these, making you the envy of your MGB car club. Welcome to another episode of Maggie's Makeover, where I'm attempting to restore my 1972 MGB that hasn't run in over 40 years. For those of you who are new to the channel, welcome aboard. For those of you who are returning, it's great to see you again. Either way, Maggie and I really appreciate you riding along with us on this episode. Now, in our last episode, Mechanic Steve was busy refurbishing Maggie's front rack and pinion steering component. There were some of you on this channel who thought I was a bit too harsh on him for trying to reuse the original piston damper pad as opposed to installing a new one. Don't cry for Argentina. Don't feel sad for Mechanic Steve. It actually forced him to go out and seek the advice of others. He connected with a gentleman by the name of Michael Crawford, shown here on the left. Michael is a member of the Boston area MG Car Club and is also a fantastic mechanic when it comes to Old English sports cars. Michael basically told Mechanic Steve, hey, just polish that new piston damper pad. Mechanic Steve did that with 400 grit sandpaper, and guess what? It fit beautifully back in the piston. On this episode, we're going to take a look at how to refurbish Maggie's front hubs. You know, I've owned this car since 1977. I probably put about 50 or 60,000 miles on it before I put it away in 1982. I never looked at the front hubs. I never repacked the bearings, so God knows what we're gonna find. Let's head down to the garage and see how Mechanic Steve is progressing. Hey, thanks, Studio Steve. I've got Maggie's front hubs here down in the garage, and they're just a mess. I guess you were right when you said you never serviced these things in the 60,000 miles that you drove Maggie. You know, the only way we're going to figure out if these can be refurbished is by taking them apart, degreasing them, and evaluating each component to see which ones need to be replaced before we assemble them back together. So let's start that process. So this first piece, this is the inside of the hub. This is the collar that actually goes on the spindle. So we'll take that out and put that over here. The next piece is the oil seal. Now these are pretty tough to get out. I actually had to put a crowbar in here. I couldn't do it with this. I've loosened it up so I can take this out for show here. So we're just gonna move this. That's the oil seal. Take that, put that here. That's gonna now expose the inner bearing. You can see the good sign is that there's grease in here, and it's you know, pretty it's not dried, right? So it's a good sign for the health of the bearings. So that's the inner bearing. Now we're gonna flip this over. Actually, let me see if I can reach in here now. We're probably gonna flip this over and it'll pop out. This is the, let's see if I can get this out. Oh, actually, yes, this is the spacer assembly right here. And then this is a shim. So unlike American cars, you actually shim these, tighten them, and then measure the amount of play. And I think it's supposed to be between 2 thousandths and maybe 4 thousandths, I think. And depending upon the number of shims, that will set that offset distance at a particular torque. So we're going to put that over here. Put that spacer there. Now we're going to turn this around. We are going to take off the front cap. Here we go. There's the front cap. Now, this front cap is going to expose the castellated nut. This is a washer, you'll see, and that has a groove in it. Where is it? Right here. I don't know if you can see that right there. That actually fits into the spline. That little center section right there. Put that down here, and here is the outer bearing. Again, looks like there's grease on this, so that's a good sign. And so now all we're going to do is just wipe all this grease off and clean it up and then degrease it. Some paper towels, and let's just start going through this. It's not rocket science, people. It's more an exercise in patience. You literally have to pick up each one of these pieces and wipe the grease off it with a paper towel. You're going to go through a lot of paper towels. Make sure you change them as you go. The job is best done listening to some of your favorite music, maybe having a couple of your favorite libations. Now, when you get to the wheel bearing itself, it's important that you get the grease out of the cage. So I simply held the wheel bearing in one hand, the paper towel in the other, and ran the paper towel up against the roller bearings. Now you got to clean the inside of the hub as well as the outside of the hub. Your ability to degrease this in the next step is only as good as the amount of grease that you actually take off in this step. Okay, so now that that's done, we're going to start the other part of the process, which is the degreasing part. But what we're going to do is we're just going to get a tray, and we're going to catch the degreasing spray, which I have here. Apply the degreaser very liberally, both on the outside of the hub as well as the inside. Spray it on both the front and the back of the hub. Make sure that when you're doing this, you have a pair of safety goggles on, because you don't want any of that spray coming back up into your face or into your eyes. Wipe down the hub with paper towels, and both on the outside and the inside, on the front and the back, and make sure you get off as much residual grease as you can. You can apply a second coat of the degreaser and wipe it down following that same procedure. I think we're going to set this aside over here, and now we're going to start to degrease. This is the front wheel bearing. Make sure that you apply the degreaser both to the front and the back surfaces of the wheel bearing cage to allow that degreaser to get into the cage and actually work on the grease that's stuck in there on the roller bearings. Again, wipe it off with a paper towel. Now it's time to move on to the other components that make up the front wheel hub, and I found that those cleaned up pretty easily with just one application of degreaser. However, both the inner and the outer wheel bearings actually took a couple of coats of degreaser in cleaning cycles to get them sufficiently clean. One could argue if I had let the first coat sit there and work on the grease, I would only have to do one. I was a little bit impatient, and so just applied 2 coats and they cleaned up very well. So that's it. That's the breakdown of the front driver's side hub and degreasing. I will, of course, do that for the passenger side hub. The next step in the process of refurbishing Maggie's front hubs is to eliminate any rust that's on them. We're going to turn to this product called Evaporust. We're going to soak both of these hubs overnight in this solution to remove that rust. And who knows, we may even get them to turn back to the original metallic color. So these are the front hubs after they've come out of soaking in the Evaporust for about a day and a half. I did take a mild metal brush and brush off any of the residue that was left on there. You can see 30 minutes out of the solution, we're already starting to get some oxidation on the fresh metal surfaces. I'll probably hit these with a coat of WD-40 to prevent that from happening. And now it's time to evaluate the condition of the front wheel bearings. You can see that there's a pretty distinct non-uniform color discoloration across the roller bearings of the outer wheel bearing. This was pretty consistent on the inner wheel bearing as well, hinting to some heat buildup of the bearings. As a result, I've actually decided to replace both the inner and outer front wheel bearings with a new set of Timken wheel bearings that match the OEM specifications for the original bearings in the car. Now, given that we want to replace the wheel bearings, the first step in that process is to actually remove the races from the old wheel bearings, which are still press fit into the hub. Now, how are we going to do that? I have a brass punch, and I'm using brass because it's softer than steel and it won't damage the inside of the hub. We're going to use this brass punch and a hammer to drift out or punch out the old wheel bearing races. So how are we going to get access to those old races in order to be able to punch them out? Well, if you look down inside of the hub, and we're looking at it from the inner bearing side through to the outer bearing side, you're going to see two recessed areas in the hub at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock that will provide access to the old race. So slowly but surely, we're going to punch on either side so that we don't misalign the race. And there it is. You can see there is the old outer bearing race that's just come out of the wheel hub. Now, similarly, for the inner bearing race, if we look down into the hub from the front to the back, you're going to see that at 9 o'clock and also at 3 o'clock, there's also a recessed area in the hub that we can gain access to the inner race. And so simply what we're going to do, like we did with the outer race, is we're going to put the punch in there and we're going to knock it on either side evenly until that bearing comes out, making sure that we don't misalign that bearing in the process. And there we go. We've knocked the inner bearing race out of the hub. With the inside of both wheel hubs thoroughly cleaned, it's time to press in the new bearing races. And there's a variety of different ways to do that. Some people take the new bearing, these are actually the old, but the new bearing, drop it in like this, and then actually use the drift tapping around in a circle to drive that new wheel bearing race in. Other people will simply drop that bearing in, the new bearing in, use the old bearing to press fit it in and tap around the outside with a hammer. I'm going to follow a different approach and use a bearing race and seal driver set from OMT. I'm going to drop the bearing in. I'm going to take the old bearing,
I'm going to face it down like this, and I'm going to use a 39.5 millimeter driver that fits inside of the old bearing, connect this handle to it, and apply a normal force down across around the whole bearing and drive that in uniformly. Similarly, on the other side, the inner side, we're going to put the new bearing in, we're going to use the old bearing, and I can't find one of these driver sets to fit on the inside, so I've picked one that sits pretty much covers the old bearing, but leaves a little space so it's not going to hit the inside of the hub. So you'll see me drop the new bearing in, take the old bearing, put this on, this driver, attach the handle, and uniformly pound that in.
Now, for those of you wondering why I'm not using the bearing driver race tool in the conventional sense, by taking the driver, placing it inside of the race, and then using it to press the race into the hub, I simply couldn't get a good fitment between the driver and the race itself, which is why I'm opting to use the old race turned upside down on the new race and a larger driver over that to pound the new bearing race into the hub. All right, so you're probably saying, Mechanic Steve, what is this cooler doing here? Is there an ice cold beer in there? Can we start drinking? No, that's not the answer. Did I donate my kidneys to science and this is going to be medevaced out? No, that's not the answer. What I did do is last night is take the bearing races and stick them in my freezer and then put them on ice to get them down here to the studio. The thought being that if we cool these, they contract and the interference bit will be less, and therefore they're going to go into the hub a lot easier. So I'm going to wipe these down just in case there's any condensation to them from that, and apply a coat of WD-40 on them. Now we're going to take this, like I said before, and you got to make sure that the tapered edge, the thicker edge is inside and the thinner edge of the bearing is on the outside, tapered edge out. So we're going to place that in there. We're going to take the old bearing, place it down here, drop the 39.5 millimeter driver in, and start to tap this in. Now you'll notice the sound is going to change once this hits the bottom of the hub. You can see that is starting to go in. And I think that's in because I can hear a difference in the sound and a different feel to the rebound of this. So there you have it. We've press fit in the outer race, wheel bearing race. And if I look inside there, that is all the way in, down, flush up against that mating surface. And now with the outer bearing race successfully installed, let's do the larger inner one. Let's go grab it out of the cooler, wipe it down, any condensation that could have formed on it. Give it a slight coating of WD-40. Now we're going to drop this in with the tapered edge, this edge out, the larger edge out. Get this so that it appears to be starting in the right place. Take the older bearing, place that on there, grab this, and now let's start driving this in. Now it's important to, as you start this, to make sure that you're starting it in a good place, and I think we are. There, hear that sound differential? That has bottomed out. Let's take a look inside here.
And it looks pretty even to me. And so with that, we've installed both the inner and the outer race in the first wheel hub.
With the bearing races press fit into the hub, it's now time to assemble the other components that go into it. You can see they're shown right here in front of the hub. Now, how do these stack up and in what order in the hub? If we go from the inner side to the outer side, there is a grease seal, an inner bearing, a bearing spacer, a number of shims, the outer bearing, a retaining washer, retaining nut, and a grease cap. Now, the order with which we're going to put these back together has a lot to do with the fact that this bearing spacer doesn't go in the front of the hub. We have to put this in the inner side of the hub, followed by the inner bearing and then the grease seal. Now, because Maggie's front suspension is not put back together, we're going to assemble these and set this aside and put it on the spindle when we assemble the front suspension. So I'm going to leave out these shims and I'm just going to place the outer bearing, the retaining washer and nut and grease cap on here and set these assemblies aside. Now, before we do any of this, we have to pack both of these bearings with grease. I have some high temperature red grease and I have a special tool here. You know, if it's anything I love to do, I love to blow Studio Steve's restoration budget by buying special tools. Most bearing packers that pack the grease into the bearings are the kind that you have to press down on and drive that grease up. Not this one. This one has a screw handle and you screw the bearing down into the grease. So before we start any of that, we got to load this grease inside of this bearing packer and get started on the process. To load the bearing packer, you first have to take it apart, which involves removing the front handle, taking out the plate with the spring, and then loading it with grease. It's a pretty greasy job, so you got to wear gloves. And what you're trying to do here is load this canister uniformly with grease, so it's about halfway full. Once you get that done, it's a matter of cleaning it up and putting this plate back in and compressing any of the air out of it.
And if you look down in here, you're going to see these holes. That's where the grease is going to come up through as we screw this handle onto that threaded rod, forcing the bearing down and the grease to come up into it. And now with the grease loaded into the packer, we're going to take the inner bearing, drop that down into the packer. We're going to screw this handle on. We're going to center it with the conical opening. Going to turn this. It's driving the grease in. I can see it start to come out the top. We want to make sure we get it in through all of those roller bearings as well. So I'm going to turn it just a little bit more just to make sure that we've done that. Okay, let's now take this off. Okay, the bearing is right there. Let's take it off of this. You can see there's definitely bearing grease on the top, on the bottom, and in through the top and the bottom of those roller bearings. So we know that those are packed with grease. We're going to drop the outer bearing in, screw this top on, seat the conical surface into the bearing, and start to drive the grease up through. I can see it coming out the top. I'm going to continue to turn it to get it to come out of, make sure it comes out of those roller bearings. Okay, let's see what we have here. Take the top off. Looks like there's a lot of grease. Oh, here's the bearing right in here. Let's pull this out. We can see it's on the top. in through the top and the bottom of the roller bearings, and obviously on the bottom. So let's set that aside. And now it's time to assemble the components in the hub. Okay, so first, now we've made sure that these are all clean from before, and this piece as well. I'm going to drop in the spacer. We're going to drop in the inner bearing, like so. I'm going to add just a little bit more grease on the top of that. And now we need to put the grease seal in. I'm going to take a little bit of this grease and just put it on the outside of this. And you're going to see a sort of a U-shaped channel on one side, and it's solid on the other side. That channel goes down. I'm going to place that in there. And we're going to grab a hammer, and we're gently going to seat this in. Maybe I'll use the driver tool. With the top of it, we got to be careful we do not damage the seal in the process. And there we go. The seal has now been driven in. And on the other side, as I said, we're just going to take this and put this outer bearing in. I'm going to put the retaining washer, the retaining nut, and we're just going to tap this cap on so that all these things are here when we're ready to assemble this hub onto the spindle when we rebuild the front suspension of Maggie, when we reassemble the front suspension of Maggie.
So we followed that exact same procedure for the other hub, and both of these hubs are now refurbished, and they're ready to be put back on Maggie's front suspension once it's reassembled. So that's it from the garage studio, Steve. Back to you. So that's a wrap on this episode of Maggie's Makeover. For those of you who are considering refurbishing your front hubs, Maggie and I hope that you found this content helpful. For those of you who have already done that job, leave some lessons learned in the comments below so other viewers can learn from your experiences. Now, this episode is the last episode of all the refurbishment work associated with the front end. Stay tuned for our next episode where mechanic Steve uses these refurbished parts along with a number of brand new parts to get Maggie back on her feet. He's going to reassemble the whole front end, steering, and suspension of Maggie. So until then, happy motoring.
This feels so weird.
Nothing worse than trying to do some voiceover work when in the middle of that, we have the people who come to actually do your lawn make some pretty crazy noises in the background as they weed whack your lawn.